Ladies and gentlemen, I shall try and avoid these lights, which are right in my eye. Good morning, very fine morning. It's a pity to be enclosed in this auditorium. Last January, my friend John Martin and I met in his upper crust London club, the Athenaeum, and we were talking about John's visit to Wrocław a couple of years ago. I brought him here as a guest. He gave a couple of lectures, and he, as he told me, he was enthralled by this city. And he decided that he wanted to do something for the benefit of the city. And he had this idea of having a Wrocław debate, an occasion when a group of people would discuss an issue, a question of broad importance. And sitting by the fire in the Athenaeum, eating buttered toast, as gentlemen in London do, we decided that we would risk this venture of a debate in Wrocław. At the time, we'd no idea whether the Wrocław Global Forum would accept us or not. And I remember our meeting finishing with the decision, we will hold our debate in Wrocław even if we end up speaking to each other on the platform of the Dworzec Główny. However, everything has developed quickly. I have to thank Fran Burwell in particular for her assistance in getting this off the ground. And here we are to talk about one of the big issues in Europe today. Everybody knows there is a huge crisis in Europe, a crisis in the Eurozone, which appears to be financial and economic, but also political, and by extension, a crisis in the European Union. But I think we're all aware that behind the immediate financial, economic, political crises, there are other problems which are not rarely brought out into the open. And the question behind the crisis is, why is it that the European movement has found itself in such difficulties? What has not been in place to make it flourish in the way that the founding fathers hoped that it would flourish? And the question of European identity, the level of consciousness of European identity among Europeans is one of these problems that needs airing. The wording that emerged for our debate was, or is, does Europe need new Europeans? And I'm very aware that the phrase new Europeans raises eyebrows. In this part of the world, people remember very well that the language of creating new people, creating the new Soviet man, for example, was part of the communist project. Equally, the Nazi movement had its idea of creating a new, in their case, master race of people who would rule Europe for 1,000 years. So the language is rather suspect. But the idea itself is as old as the hills, namely that every new community must create consciousness among its members in order for it to flourish. Before we start, I think we should draw to everybody's attention the American example. I don't think, I may be wrong, that in American history people have used terms like the new American man or creating new Americans. But nonetheless, this is exactly what the Americans have succeeded in doing. From a bunch of 13 colonies into which migrants arrived, speaking every language, practicing every religion, possessing every sort of separate identity, the United States has succeeded in creating Americans, i.e. a nation with a very strong sense of its own identity. I think it's fair to say, whatever the political model that the European movement had in mind, it was expected that the Europeans would take on a strong identity, strong common identity, in order to follow the common purpose. And what we will be debating today is whether Europe, in fact, needs to create a new European, a new sort of person, a new level of consciousness, so that Europe may thrive. To this end, I assembled the distinguished panel that you see before you. On the far side is Brendan Sims, Professor of Cambridge University. I was thinking it was the correct title, the International Idea. But Brendan is much more than a professor. He is, of course, Irish. I would say actively Irish. He's also very active in European politics, and he has written and thought a lot about this question of how Europe can get its act together. Next is Dr. Leik Charnitski. I found out only, I think, this morning that Dr. Czarnecki was going to be a civil engineer if his family had had their way. And in order to keep them quiet, he has organized a little civil engineering project which is called the Sky Tower, which stands before my window. He is a doctor of economics, born, of course, in Wrocław, and, of course, a banker of great distinction. Next is my colleague from Oxford, Professor Zielonka, who is a fellow of St. Anthony's College, as I am, and who has a very rich career, again, having been born in Wrocław, like Dr. Czarnecki. Professor Zielonka left Poland in the 1980s, had one career in the Netherlands, then in a second one in Florence, in Italy, at the European University, and now at Oxford, so he is extremely well qualified to talk on these things. And lastly, the brain behind this panel, Professor John Martin, I usually describe him as a poet and a painter who, in his spare time, is a double professor of cardiology. He has one chair at UCL in London and another at Yale University in the States. He is a Renaissance man, as somebody mentioned this morning, and it's thanks to him that this event is taking place. Each of the panelists will speak for 10, 11, 12 minutes. If they ramble on too long, I shall exercise a little discipline. We'll then have a break, and in the second part, we'll move to an open discussion in which I hope you will take part. We'll start with Brendan Sims. The speakers, I think, will speak from the lectern, which is, I think, more convenient. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Norman, for that kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank the Wrocław Global Forum very much for the invitation. I'm extremely impressed by the city, particularly by its openness to its complex past, and of course its openness to the world today. If new Europeans are being made, or will be made, I'm sure they will be made here. Now, the European project has always aimed to create new Europeans. It has been based from the start on the idea of reconciliation between nations, particularly the French and the Germans, but of course Germans and Poles as well. And there's been the idea of starting young, the idea of having a school book comparison, for example, that nationalist myths should not be perpetuated. We have the Erasmus program for the university students, and there are many other initiatives. I don't want to talk about them here this morning. I'd like to approach my subject from a rather different angle by asking you to imagine the emergence of a new European man, and of course woman, from the vantage point of 2020. 10 years from now, 6 years after the establishment of the United States, or 4 years after the establishment of the United States of Europe in 2016. Now, I do this not with any frivolous or whimsical intent, I hope, but in all seriousness, on the grounds that we first need to imagine or to predict the future before it can be made reality. I'd like to focus my remarks on the emergence of a new European generation, which will be known as Generation M, because it was born around the turn of the millennium. My short story has a cast of 6. Connor, born in Dublin in 2000. Lauma, born in Galway in 2000. Lauma is indeed her name because, like many Irish people, she had a Latvian mother and an Irish father, reflecting the complexity of the new Europe. Dimitris, born in Castoria, northern Greece, in 2000, Annalisa in Athens in 2000, Astrid in Barcelona in 2000, Felipe in Madrid in 2000. Now, the formative experiences of this generation were the European crisis and European regeneration. They were, of course, almost too young to remember the 2008 financial crash and the start of the sovereign debt crisis in 2010-2011. What really impressed them, what traumatized them and formed them, was the crisis and fragmentation of Europe in 2012 to 2014, beginning, of course, with the Greek default, leading to the departure of Greece from the euro and ultimately from the European Union, the Spanish default, followed by the Italian and the Portuguese. This, of course, resulted in the famous central blowout of the French banking system, as it were destroying the European currency at its very centre. Ireland hung on in this situation, but was subject to a strong austerity programme, and its population felt strongly disenfranchised. Now, the political consequences of this crisis were very grave. France was thrown into turmoil, the National Front continued to grow in influence, extremism racked much of Europe. In Spain, of course, there were regional tensions. Astrid, whom I've mentioned, toyed briefly with Catalan nationalism as a solution to our difficulties. Ireland saw the continued rise of the Sinn Féin nationalist movement. But the situation was even worse beyond the boundaries of the European Union. Greece, which had left, subsided into domestic turmoil. Dimitris and Annalisa experienced real poverty, and of course, because they were no longer part of the European Union, it was not easy to emigrate. Europe also lost its appeal beyond its border. What had been a civilizing influence throughout the 1990s and early 2000s was no longer as strong, with the result that in Ukraine and in Belarus, nationalist, xenophobic, and dictatorial elements were emboldened. And indeed, the same sentiments grew more confident in Russia, which caused great nervousness, of course, in Poland, but in the Baltic states as well, where Lauma, who I mentioned, lives in Ireland but has relatives in Latvia, is extremely concerned. The solution to this crisis was found or originated in the creation of a new political party, the Party of Democratic Union, which was founded by a group of intellectuals and politicians and academics in 2013, prevailed in the 2014 European elections, and, I won't bore you with the details, ultimately, in 2016, managed to pull together the famous Continental Convention, which led to the creation of the Democratic Union, essentially a political unification of the former Eurozone, with Greece, Ireland, and Spain as part of it, Poland indeed joining as well, although it had not been as badly affected by the economic crisis. It was nervous about the situation on its eastern border. Its parliamentary system was made up of a Senate representing the individual former member states and a House of Peoples, elected, like the American system, on the basis of population. It was presided over by a president who was elected for one 4-year term. The first president, of course, was a Pole called Sikorski. There was debt federalization. States were forced to agree to head towards a balanced budget. The common language of the Democratic Union was English. Now, this, of course, was the structure, but it was not yet the unification of peoples in Europe. To be sure, there was a common political space. It was characterized by a debate in English, a common language. You had recruitment, compulsory recruitment of young people into the army and civilian service. And 2018 saw the first cohort enter into service. Conor and Felipe both joined the army, Felipe going to the Union Tank School near Zamość. Dimitris, because he was a pacifist, did civilian service in a hospital. Astrid joined the Union Border Police as a trainee. Annalisa joined the Union Development Corporation, which was involved in construction and development projects. The early political life of the Union, of this republic, was very turbulent. Europeans fought about everything. There were distributional struggles between regions, between generations. Dimitris, for example, couldn't see why in hospitals he should look after aging Western baby boomers. On the other hand, the point was made to him very forcefully that the taxes and bonds and resources of these self-same baby boomers were helping to pay his parents' pensions in Greece. All the same, founding fathers and mothers were apt to bewail the lack of a common European spirit. The new republic, as I say, in 2017-18 was in a spirit of malaise. Many observers spoke of the need for a new European man to match the existence of the new European state. And they wondered whether in first creating their sprawling mighty union, they hadn't put the cart before the horse. That, of course, was before the Great Eastern Crisis of 2019. Because after Europe unified, despite the difficulties within the Union, the European idea became more popular, more persuasive in Belarus and the Ukraine. There were strong demands among its population, particularly the younger, more outward-looking population, to join the Union and to join NATO. This resulted, of course, in a standoff, civil war-style situation with the Russians supporting the anti-Union side. In the Ukraine, this was resolved peacefully. Unfortunately, Belarus was racked by massacres in the summer of 2019, with President Lukashenko clinging to power. Militias let loose with Russian protection and also Russian sponsorship at the UN Security Council. The tipping point was the Grodno massacre, where 14 ethnic Poles protesting against compulsory Russification were murdered by Belarusian militias. After a bitter debate, the Union finally intervened. Technically, this was a war. In reality, it was more of a skirmish, as the Lukashenko regime quickly folded. Now, all three men of my generation served in the resulting conflict, in some capacity or another. Felipe, as I say, a graduate of the Zamość Union Tank School, was among the first to reach Grodno. Connor served as an infantryman. Dimitris, as I've mentioned, as a pacifist, did civilian service. He helped with traumatized children in Belarus. Annalisa's Union Construction Corporation helped to rebuild the country. Astrid's Union Border Police moved simply to the eastern border of Belarus. These events had huge political and psychological importance within Europe. It was a common project which Europeans had not been able to tackle individually, but they had solved collectively. Dimitris had opposed the war, but as Lukashenko's prisons opened, he too recognized that it had been necessary. Europeans, like Connor, Felipe, and Astrid, came away, in other words, with a powerful feeling that they had done something not only worthwhile, but unprecedented in European history. Historians and political scientists and observers debated all this at length. They described the way in which the new generation, Generation M, had indeed become a completely different sort of European. One way or the other, it was agreed that the new Europe had created new Europeans and not the other way around. Thank you for your attention.
Brendan, one quick question. In your lovely imaginary scenario, you didn't mention the United Kingdom breaking up and the future of Scotland, which I think is 2014 is the Scottish referendum. Would that play a part?
Can you all hear me? Yes. Yes. I think my sort of meta response to this is that I don't envisage the United Kingdom being part of this democratic union, not because I oppose it in principle. In fact, I think it would be highly desirable. But as you know, there's a strong Eurosceptic element within Britain. And I think that there is overwhelming support in Britain for the idea of European unification without Britain. In other words, Britons wish Europe well. And I think by insisting on including Britain in this new union, we simply confuse the debate in Britain. I think we should not expect Britain to join this new union in the same way as we wouldn't expect the United States to. We would expect them to be like a bulwark of the medieval church, supporting it from the outside. And the reason for this is that, in my opinion, Europe is designed to fix something which in Britain was never broken. So that Britain serves, I think, as a model, and the United States serve as a model for Europe, rather than the other way around. As regards Scotland, I think Alex Salmond has chosen exactly the wrong moment to have his referendum, because all of his models, that is to say, Ireland, Iceland, as alternative paths for Scottish development to that of the Union, all those have rather imploded. And I think that the same reasons that led to the creation of the Union in 1707, in other words, concern about the state of Europe, will help to keep it together in 2014. But I can't be sure of that.
Thank you. One quick remark and then we move on, yes.
Brendan, I'm slightly frightened by your concept of a major war breaking out because of the present crisis. And it's important that academics like you and I should speculate about the future, because most people are trapped in small steps of economics, taking us forward 6 months at a time. But I disagree with your scenario. I think it's more likely that out of this will become a very strong central block of stability. with union between France, Germany, the Netherlands at the center of it. That will give political and monetary stability. And because of the European tradition of 1,000 years of caring for each other, they will then organize and administer the weaker countries around them. And stability will occur by, what was your date, 2016? What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's certainly a plausible scenario. It worries me, first of all, because I think that French and Dutch would be uneasy about going into such a narrower union with Germany because they would be overborne by the larger Germany. I think Germans themselves don't wish to overbear anybody if they can possibly help it. I think it would be very worrying for the Poles and for anybody in the East because such a bloc would not have the consciousness of the really pressing issues that face us in the Baltic with Article 5, with collective security. And what you would have would be something very similar to what we have today, which is a Germany which is increasingly emancipating itself or breaking loose from collective structures. We see this in Libya, although that was possibly a bit of a blip. We see this in the disagreements about what to do about Russia. And I think that if Germany felt able simply to shelter behind an intermediate zone to the east and then trade as it liked with other states without having to contribute to an overall European security system, it will become increasingly a free rider and will be resented as such. So it's in nobody's interest that that should happen.
Could I ask Leszek to take the stand, please? We started a little late, so I'll try and recover a bit of time.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a really great honor and great pleasure for me, especially because I was born here and this is my hometown. So, we have the question, if Europe needs new Europeans, and start thinking about this, I realized that the reason why such a question is raising is because the crisis we struggle in Europe. 4 years ago, we woke up like Alicia and we crossed the mirror and we woke up in the completely different world, like Alicia in Wonderland. We don't really understand the threats we meet. We don't really understand the order. We don't really know how to react right now. So maybe in this new world, new Europe, we need new Europeans. But before answering this question, I would like to spend a little bit of time answering different questions, which I believe are even more important. And once we realize the answers for those questions, we could come to the conclusion if Europe needs new Europeans. First of all, thinking about the crisis, it brings me the question, it is the end of the economic order, the economic status quo we know. Is it the end of globalization? And finally, is it the end of democracy? As far as economic order is concerned, I could say that definitely no. We have a lot of analogies from the past. For example, Latin America, 2001, Russia, 1998, or Far East, 1997, where the big part of continents were under the huge crisis. Maybe not as big as this one, but big enough. And all those countries successfully survive. Right now, they are developing. So I strongly believe that the capitalism will survive as well, and this is certainly not the end of the economic order, as some economists claim and some journalists claim. So next question. I raise, maybe it's the end of the globalization. There are so many claims that, in fact, globalization was the one reason why we meet the crisis. Actually, somehow it might be the truth, because globalization, supported by IT, by technology, and by liberalization in the financial world, is halfly responsible for the crisis. But there are no return from the globalization process. So I disbelieve that all protests really have any sense. And it was last week mentioned by President Leik Charnitski once we discussed globalization issue. He said the anecdotes that he really don't understand all those people who are protesting against globalization, and they agreed for the meeting using internet or the cell phones. So why don't they use pigeons? Finally, is the end of the democracy, especially looking what happened in China, how fast this country is developing, looking what's going on in other countries. Somebody claims that probably democracy is not the best system. I'm strongly disbelieve with such an opinion, and certainly it's not the end of democracy, although there are a lot of threats that might happen. We remember what happened during Deep Depression last century and right after Deep Depression, where totalitarianism and autocratism came to the power in many countries, especially in Europe. Right now we see what happened in some countries, how people react for the austerity programs and how they protest against any savings. So the threat is here, and we have to face it. As far as the whole crisis is concerned, it was probably everything said already about the reasons of this crisis. So I would like to remind you just a few words. We have a common currency, we have the Eurozone, although it's a half-baked political and economic experiment. It's not really done well. We have only assets, but there are no way to manage and measure liabilities. There are no common budget policy, there are no budget discipline, and European Union funds distribution without any obligations. So all those things must be changed. And the question is how we could finally finish this crisis, and who could finish this crisis. And Europeans, as we meet right now, or maybe new Europeans. First of all, in opposite to American crisis, which in my opinion was mostly just a financial problem, although in the huge, large scale, we have in Europe a totally, completely different problem, which is much more political problem than just a banking and the financial sector problem, although obviously the financial sector problem increased the scale of crisis. So once European Union as an organization, as the union of independent countries be improved, be more integrated, I hardly believe we could finish the crisis we meet right now, and I hardly believe Eurozone could survive. A lot of people claim that we have maybe weeks, maybe months, and probably they are right, maybe not just a weeks, but the time is shorting. Then we obviously need to do the huge reform in the financial sector, including the strong, the real one, Central European Bank, which takes responsibility for the inflation in the whole Europe. It wouldn't be easy because some countries, the richer one, including Germany and the other Western countries, probably will have to pay for the others, and they will have to agree for bigger inflation. The weaker countries, which produce the problems, will have to agree in the very worst scenario to be managed by some sort of commissary board. I don't know if it's just a not political fiction story, but probably this is the way to resolve the problem. So finally, we have the question if it's possible to do by current European, or we need a new Europeans. I believe that Europe doesn't need to create a new European, but Europe must define itself once again. And there is a huge potential impact coming from the new European countries, like Poland, because for the last 40 years, 50 years, we had to struggle with the huge uncertainty. We lived under the huge crisis, being under the communist regime. So meeting the situation we have right now is actually nothing really new. And I believe that the European Union, the same as European zone, it's a superior value, fundamental to peace in Europe, and it should be maintained at the all cost. And we, Poles and Poland, have a significant right to fight for this and support and fighting for Europe, for United Europe, for Eurozone, because I believe that this is very, very fundamental for future peace in Europe. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Leszek. You started by talking of Alice in Wonderland. You probably know Alice in Wonderland, stories created in Oxford by a professor of mathematics who took the pen name of Lewis Carroll. Do you think that we still live in an Alice in Wonderland? Do we live in a world where the logic appears to have gone wrong, or do we live in a rational Europe where people really understand what needs to be done and what the solutions might be? Are we nearer to Alice in Wonderland or nearer to a rational community?
The difference between being in rational world and acting like Alice in Wonderland, I think depends on this: if could we predict the future? Or we cannot. The problem is that right now there are so many different opinions about the future, coming from experts, from economists, from journalists, from politicians, that I'm rather agree that this is still a wonderland, much more than the safe, predictable, sweet home.
Thank you. I think I would agree. I had instructions to take questions from the floor, but the panel actually has difficulty in seeing the audience, and we're just a bit short of time. Unless there's a really urgent question, I'll accept one from John, but I'll try to keep moving on. A quick question then, John, yes?
Leszek, I liked your concept that the Poles know what a crisis is. This isn't a real crisis. And I tend to to agree with you. Do you think that the euro has been a terrific success? Its primary function for me is a political symbol, that Germany and France that fought each other said we'll even go so far as mixing our sovereignty to have a common currency. And doesn't it remain a symbol of that potential unity in this crisis? The main problem is one of debt and lack of mutualization of debt, as was done in the United States. If we had our own currencies, then perhaps things would be far, far worse in this crisis of debt without an anchor, a political concept, which is the euro, to hang on to. What do you think about that?
It's very difficult to be supportive for Eurozone right now. Although I still believe that having the common currency in Europe is a good and great concept. Although, answering directly your question, obviously Eurozone doesn't work properly, and certainly doesn't work in the way that it was designed before. Because, as I said, there is a common currency which allowed to keep a very low interest and make very easy for every union members to increase their debt, and there were no obligations, no liabilities on the other side. So it can be done in this way. But on the other hand, I use a completely different example to answering your question. Let's assume that, start discussing globalization. If the globalization is a good thing or bad thing, obviously it comes a lot of goods to the whole humanity. There are no doubt. And let's take examples of producing cars. As all we know, there are only few engine producers in the world. There are very few brakes or clutch producers in the world which are implemented in every car we know. There are just a few because of the globalization. And let's assume that one day the number of accidents, car accidents, significantly increase. And the number of it increased in such a huge scale that we have a bankruptcy of insurance companies, the healthcare is in trouble, and there is a huge dispute what's going on with these cars. And engineers find out that this is the problem, that the whole braking system, all brakes we implement into the cars coming from one producer were designed in the wrong way. And then dispute is starting. Some claims, you know what, we should go back to the solution we used in the beginning of 20th centuries. At that time, there were not such an accident. And there are some more even radical opinion. Why don't we stop produce cars? There will be no accident. And obviously, it's a ridiculous solution because thanks to globalization, all those cars are much cheaper. So the industry in the entire world could be much more efficient, much cheaper, because having a car is available to everybody. It's exactly the same with Eurozone. So it's not the problem of discussing each Eurozone doesn't make sense or done, but let's discuss how to improve it.
Thank you very much. Jan, I think, is the next on the stand, if we can ask you.
Thank you, Norman. I'm delighted to be back in the city. I'm grateful for giving me this opportunity. I spent some beautiful years here, and I particularly fondly remember my passion for Roman law. Had they given me a job in Roman law, I would stay here rather than hanging around in all other medieval cities of Europe. I wanted to say things on a similar topic Mr. Czarnecki said, but he just got things right. Why should I repeat it? Let me just, you see, keep my notes in my pocket and say a few words about the new man and Europe, and we'll see where we are. Look, to start with, I agree with Norman's initial skepticism about the creations of new men. Try to imagine this, how Europe would create a new man. What would be the prototype? A piece of kind of Franco-German, good virtues, a new Merkozy prototype, you know, mixture of Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Merkozy, or it would be a mixture of Queen Elizabeth and Silvio Berlusconi. And what? Are we talking about cloning, you know, more of the same? And who will be in charge of this process? Dr. Barroso and Dr. Van Rompuy? No, thank you. No. It's too much for even my wild imagination. And Norman was right. All this experiment in history, not starting with communists. You know, Jacobins tried also to create a new man. They utterly failed. And I believe that if European Commission would embark on the job of creating humanity, it would be not a tragedy this time, but a farce. So no, thank you. What can Europe do then? Well, I think Europe can do a lot of good things. It can create opportunities for men to advance and to progress, to develop. It can create an environment in which man feels free and has a chance to go further. And in fact, for many years, Europe has done exactly that. It has been seen as an oasis of prosperity and security in a rather, you know, barbarian environment and against barbarian history of Europeans themselves. And this city and its history knows very well what is our legacy. We have created something what people look with envy, and everybody lined up to join it. Well, we succeeded to join it exactly at the moment when something started to go wrong. And we can argue whether these are days, months, or years, but you know, and what is the probability that it will go wrong? But tell me, I don't know. Let's say it's not very high. It's not like people said the 80% chance that euro will break. No. And if euro will break, bet the common market will break too. Yeah? And if there's no common market, you know what I mean. Yeah? And whether it's war or not, I don't know. I'm not an astrologer. But let's say it's not 80%. Let's say it's 20% chance that it breaks. Will you buy a car with a chance that it will break down tomorrow? 20%? No. But there is a problem. This is a real problem because although in this country, but in some others, you know, people are still happy with Europe. At the center of Europe, for instance, Berlin, and Anna and myself, been yesterday, and we heard German politicians, they are very frustrated with the way the union is going. They think we have to pay for this. They take our money and run and just make mess out of this. But if you go to those countries which are supposed to be messing around, they say, look, the Greeks are saying we can eat stones and drink rainwater. From now on, we will never get out of this hole because there is a structural inequality here. We are not being able to progress, and only to have a stick with no opportunity to get out of this doesn't really help. We've got into such a moment in which everybody is frustrated and everybody is unhappy. And the idea that somehow, miraculously, they will find a new deal in the last moment, it's, you know, even with the Polish Pope, I wouldn't bet on that. And what to do? I think today we have, first of all, to act as a fire brigade. And we just not only have to think about calming markets, we have also to think about calming people who are angry. So we need to have to restore confidence. And I think you don't restore confidence with calming with the big revolutionary projects. But of course you have to think about the future. What is the future? What is the paradigm here? Because it's not only about dimes, it's also about paradigms. What you do with, you want to make sure that you get good value for your money. And here we talk about inspirations. And United States was here mentioned as inspirations, and many people believe United States of Europe. Well, there's a small problem here, of course, that United States of America is a state. And if you want to join United States of Europe, you have to give up your own state. Well, American states had to do the same. And as you know, there was a small civil war there, not so small. So I take inspirations from my medieval Florence, which actually, in the period of Renaissance, was able to provide those conditions, however tiny it was, for people exactly to advance and progress, with a generous support for not just, economic development, but also culture, also science. There were bad things there too. Dante was expelled from Florence. He was not allowed to return. Savonarola was able to persecute his enemies for much too long. But gosh, go to the Basilica Santa Croce. This city produced Boccaccio, Machiavelli, yes, Dante, yes, Galileo. And you go from one grave to another and you think, yes, this is Europe I want to live in. So there might be different inspirations, but first things first, let's get this crisis under some control.
Thank you very much, Jan. You started by talking colourfully about cloning Queen Elizabeth with Berlusconi. And that's an extreme example of what is creating the new man. But how about creating consciousness, a new consciousness, both new human being? One of the things that you using Italy, or certainly medieval Italy as your example. In 1860, one of the Italian leaders of the Risorgimento said, "We have now created Italy, we must now create Italians." So it was, as it was, a project in Italy. And in Florence, there was a very strong consciousness of being Florentine, of having values and achievements and municipal pride. I'm sure you know Dante, the great loss he had of being separated from this community. So consciousness is what's important, not the new biological man, but we are educators. Do you think that we can, as it were, educate people towards a new form of consciousness?
Look, I cannot say that I don't believe in education. I would just have to give up my job, But I don't believe that you can engineer culture, consciousness. You can engineer institutions. You can adopt a decree, a law, a constitution. But you cannot manipulate values. You have to talk to people. You have to argue. Here, states or unions are not the best actors to do the job. People, yesterday we had at the podium,
and Jeff was introducing them. These are the actors, you know, freedom fighters, organizations like National Endowment for Democracy, media anchors, artists, academics, and of course politicians should enter this discourse, but you cannot really do it through decrees and international agreements. I just don't believe in that this works this way. But of course we have to stand for our values, and part of these things is to give us freedom to debate those things, but at this time warn against dangers of, you know, of populism and everything it brought bad in the history of mankind.
Would it be fair to say that is equivalent to hoping for the best? Or I share your skepticism, but if, as it were, we say that this goal of improving consciousness is not attainable by organizational methods, are we just hoping that somehow it will all come together? Or do we think that it's not possible? Or is it a miracle that happens here and there without us knowing how it happens?
Look, in the history of mankind, you have good periods and bad periods. It's the way you cope with crisis, like the way you cope with prosperity. You can, you know, I don't want to say that we don't need institutions to handle those things, but and I don't want to say that it's impossible to manipulate culture. Look, Milosevic manipulated cultures beautifully, you know. But at the same time, it takes time and effort to create Italians, as you know. 2 centuries after effort started, I talked to people in Lombardia and Calabria. There is, look, it is to manipulate culture is something I wouldn't advocate. But to have a cultural dialogue, this is something I believe in. And let's see. But of course, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have rules, doesn't mean that we shouldn't have institutions, and yes, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have Europe, because actually Europe stands for those values which give us this opportunity: diversity, pluralism, flexibility. But today it is very much seen as something opposite. You know, basically rigidity, punishments. You know, look what Europe is asking from governments. It asks them to embark on austerity programs. It asks parliaments not to basically take sovereign decisions. It doesn't protect them from globalized markets. It doesn't give them opportunity to share debts. We should reverse this. If we create Europe, which gives people this opportunity, which empower people rather than kind of restrict them, then I believe people will go for this. People will go for this.
Thank you. Your turn, John.
Thank you, Norman. I'd like to, first of all, just thank Fran Burwell for allowing us to do this and helping us with the organisation and the Atlantic Council. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I think the previous 2 speakers are unimaginative cynics. And that's just what we don't want in moments of crisis. Nothing personal, gentlemen. And I do think that we need to create a new man. Not in the form that Norman was suggesting of Homo Sovieticus, but we need a completely new approach to create a European man. And I think the people want this. Yesterday, the people of Ireland voted 60% for austerity and suffering, because clearly they believe in something. The problem is we're not clear what that belief is. The week before, in 7 countries, there was a poll of whether the people wanted to go back to their old currencies or stay in the euro. In every country, the great majority of people voted, not voted, but were assessed as wanting to stay in the euro. I do believe that the people of Europe really believe in the project, which is now in great difficulty. And yesterday afternoon, Jan hadn't arrived then, but we speakers met some young students here in I nearly said Krakow. I'm sorry, Mr. President, here in Wrocław. We met some young students to discuss this, and we were all amazed by these young people's enthusiasm for the European concept. Now, the problem is that our politicians do not understand this, simply because they're involved in taking small steps, month by month, to try and solve an economic crisis. And there's an even bigger problem in politics, Mr. Kemp. What is politics? I asked a leading conservative politician last week in London. He thought hard and said, John, politics is a contract between political parties and the press. I thought, my God, how cynical. Where have we come in the way we're running our societies? Now, what the people of Europe need is a new idea. Not a new economic process, not mechanics, but an idea. Now, my day job is to be a cardiologist, and I'm a particular sort of cardiologist. I invent new treatments for the future. And it's my job to have an idea about how we're going to treat heart attacks in 10 or 15 years' time. The rest of my colleagues are running around every day treating heart attacks and can't think. They're like politicians and economists. I have to think radically, and if I don't think as I am now, let's put new genes into the heart when you have a heart attack, using a virus to get them in, and that's what I'm doing. I did it in 15 patients so far. We won't be there in 15 years' time. And I think there's an analogy with European politics at the moment. We need a radically new idea that we can give to the people of Ireland that have voted to austerity. Now, this reorientation of European politics has to be radical. At the moment, the objective of most political structures is economic growth. There is nothing else. There are no great moral problems. There's economic growth every year forever. But why? Science has given us the ability to have a good life, electric light, warmth, security. Our soldiers have good weapons produced by science to defend us. We have iPads for communication. We have, in the European Union, everything we need for a good life. I think the people are not responding to this political concept of growth year by year. And this growth year by year is based upon a scientific concept that's arisen through the 19th and 20th century, that human beings are molecular machines. And among my colleagues in science, this is the great debate. Are we simply molecular machines? And if we are, then economics is our destiny. But if I'm a molecular machine and have a soul, not simply in the Christian sense, but in the 19th century German romantic sense, if I have a soul, then the prime object of politics should be that soul, not my molecular machine. So I want to propose to you that the new political idea should be that the objective of the European Union politics is not the economy, but the individual, and the internal fulfillment of the individual to achieve individual happiness. Now, that might seem to you ridiculously romantic and idealistic, but coming back to my analogy, to my research life, unless we think radically ahead, we'll never achieve it. And I think this is in the European tradition. The last 1,000 years of the history of the world has been the spread of European idea around the world, excluding China and Japan. And the Atlantic Alliance is a product of that. The American tradition is a product of the spreading of that European idea. And for me, the culmination of that idea is an identification of the individual, not as a machine, but as a whole human being with a soul, that started first with Shakespeare in the tragedies, who, unlike the Greek tragedies, analysed for the first time the internal man. And the great flowering of that is in Freud, and our understanding of our deep internal, primarily psychosexual, but our deep internal motivations that can give us happiness or can inhibit our happiness. And man achieves that internal understanding through culture, through music and poetry and art and good cinema or good television and good conversation. So I want to suggest to you that the European new man should be the product of a politic that gives Europeans the tools to do that. Not that, as Jan was perhaps suggesting, engineers in some totalitarian way that people shall think differently, but they should be given the tools to achieve internal fulfillment through culture. Now, if that is the role of the state, then the state, of course, has to provide defence and economics and law to do that. But it's a question of reorientating where we go, that economics becomes a tool of individual fulfillment. And in this scenario, then capitalism is there to produce the wealth, to help the state, to support the individual. And then the combination of all those fulfilled individuals will make a new society. Because I believe that in the Christian approach, the European approach, that individuals cause society, not the Marxist approach that society causes the individual. And we're tending towards that with our present economics. And this would be a little bit like my own National Health Service. When I'm working in Yale as a professor, most of my Yale colleagues think that the British National Health Service is a communist structure. It's not. It really works. And I offer people free healthcare when they want it. I don't determine they should have it, but I'm there for everybody to give them healthcare. And I think I deliver that in equal quality to the healthcare I deliver in Yale, my American colleagues. I'm suggesting that an analogy with the National Health Service could be a government system that has the intention, the idea, they will offer internal fulfillment to the individual as their primary objectives. So economics is important, the state is important, capitalism important, but reorientated towards the individual. Now, yesterday, I put this idea to the young students, and some of them were captivated by it, and they said, we want this now. And this is another problem. The previous two speakers have accepted a status quo. Brendan, I thought, was very creative, that there isn't a crisis, we can't engineer things, let's see how things go. Now, as a scientist, again, I'm always looking at evolution. There's a theory from an American called Gould of punctuate equilibrium in evolution. If you look at the fossil record, nothing occurs in evolution for tens of millions of years. And then there's a sudden jump and something happens and a newness is created, often out of crisis, like the extinction of the dinosaur. Could it be out of this crisis, if we have the right idea of what to do, we could form this new man and use it to our advantage? The other disappointing thing is that these ideas should be coming from our universities, as they have over the last 1,000 years. And I find the university a more and more sterile place, Brendan, because governments see universities, again going back to economics, as educating people as workers in a future economy, again being influenced subconsciously by man, the molecular machine, not having in mind the role of the university as being primarily to ennoble society and then to produce workers. So everywhere we need a reorientation of what we are doing. So, Norman, I think that we do need new Europeans. We cannot engineer them in a totalitarian way. Jan, I agree with that. But we have to think in a visionary way, and this has to be enunciated by politicians who at the moment are only concerned about their own survival within their own party. And perhaps Brendan is right. Perhaps we do need a new visionary European party that can take advantage of this crisis to change society. But Brendan, if we're going to do that, it has to be based upon an idea that has to be novel, that has to be visionary, and has to be appealing to the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Reordering priorities. I'm tempted, because you use your professional metaphor of a cardiologist, to continue the metaphor, it would be that Europe is on the brink of a heart attack. And in that case, do you see the key idea as being part of preventative medicine or of saving the patient on the brink of death?
Well, it's a good metaphor, Norman, and I think it's saving the patient on the point of death. But we've learned to do that. We can now stop you having a heart attack over 20 years by lowering your cholesterol, your blood pressure, stopping you smoking. But we now know, well, you would often die from a heart attack just up to 10 years ago. But now we can put a balloon in your coronary artery while you're having it. We can blow it up. We can get rid of the obstruction. We can get blood flowing again. And that was a fantastic idea from one Swiss guy. And everybody said, this is mad. But now we're using it all the time in Wrocław to treat heart attacks today. So it's that sort of thing that we need. We need the idea with a new mechanism to stop the patient dying from this crisis.
Thank you. Are there any comments, Leszek, perhaps?
Actually, John, I have two questions, because listening to you, actually I understood that you were talking much more about creating a new politicians than the new European man. New politicians who brings us new visions, new ideas that we could follow. So if you could comment that. And the second question is, you said that the thing we need is a constant growth. Don't you think that having a constant growth is some sort of utopia? It's simply impossible, because having a crisis time to time is a fundamental thing of capitalism, free marketing system, which achieve us to being more efficient and cut prices of goods and services.
Your second question, I agree with you. Constant growth is not possible. But I think if you look at the news, you read the newspaper, you hear the speeches from our politicians, the assumption is that their job is to have year-on-year growth. And if we slip back 0.01%, there is anguish and crying. So I want to, in what I was saying, I want to distinguish between the present action of politicians, which is trapped into a very limited view of the economic world of constant growth. What was the other question, Leszek?
By the way, if somebody mentions about the constant growth, it reminds me the maid of Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, it's like a Ponzi scheme. Your other question was about politicians. Do we have to change politicians? from my view of walking around the House of Lords and the House of Commons in Westminster, is that these people are not changeable. I think that they are locked into their small, introverted world in a way that we just have to get rid of them. Somebody said last night, I don't know whether it was you or Norman, that there may be a collapse of political parties. No, sorry, it was Prince Michael of Liechtenstein after dinner was saying there may be a complete collapse of political parties because of this crisis. I hope there is, and I hope something new can come out of that. So I don't think we can change these people. I think we need a completely new generation of politicians like we four here could probably go and do a better job than they did.
I know people want to join in, but I think I'm going to call the break now because we started late. If we break for 20 minutes, we're back here at 11:45. We'll start with Jan giving the question that I brutally prevented him from asking. And we intend to go on until about 1:45, 10 minutes to 1, as long as there are questions. We very much hope the audience will participate. Bardzo oczekujemy, że publiczność będzie brał udział w tym wszystkim. 20 minut przerwy, 20 minutes break. Thank you.